The text arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was grading papers at my kitchen table. A message from my sister, Mandy. "Hey, can you watch the kids this weekend? Dan and I want to go look at houses by the lake." I stared at my phone, a cold wave washing over me. Dan, my husband. Except he wasn't mine anymore, was he? He was hers now. My own sister had taken the man I'd built a life with, the father of my children, and somehow I was supposed to babysit while they shopped for their dream home together. It had been 8 months since I discovered their affair. 8 months of tears, therapy, and trying to explain to my children why Daddy was living with Aunt Mandy now. 8 months of her flaunting their relationship across social media while I picked up the pieces of our shattered family. And now this, a casual text asking me to enable their house-hunting weekend getaway as if she hadn't destroyed my life. I set my phone down without responding, my hands trembling as I tried to focus on the stack of third-grade math quizzes in front of me. But the words and numbers blurred together as my mind spiraled back to how it all began. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Part 1. The Setup and Disruption. I'm Rebecca Wilson. Becca to everyone who knows me. At 34, I thought I had the life I'd always wanted. A loving husband, 2 beautiful children, a cozy home in Cedarwood, and a fulfilling job teaching elementary school. Dan and I had been together since college, married for 11 years. We weren't perfect, but we were solid, or so I believed. My sister Mandy is 3 years younger, always the wild one, always reaching for more. While I settled into family life, she chased her career in marketing, climbing corporate ladders, and collecting designer shoes. We weren't as close as sisters should be, but we managed holiday gatherings and occasional family dinners without issue. At least, that's what I told myself. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs, the way Dan's eyes followed her when she entered a room, how he laughed a little too enthusiastically at her jokes, the sudden business trips that coincided with her marketing conferences. But trust is a funny thing. It blinds you to what you don't want to see. It was an ordinary Thursday last spring when my world collapsed. I'd borrowed Dan's laptop to order gifts for Jack's birthday when a notification popped up. A hotel confirmation. Email. 4 nights at the Silver Lake Resort. The same weekend, Dan claimed he had a financial advisors conference in Chicago. The same weekend, my sister mentioned a girls' trip she was taking. My stomach knotted as I opened his messages, something I'd never done before. And there it was, months of conversations between them. Intimate photos, plans for their future, complaints about me, about our life together. "Becca doesn't understand me like you do," he'd written. "We've grown apart. I'm just going through the motions." I sat frozen at our kitchen table, the same one where we'd shared family dinners for years, where I'd helped our children with homework, where Dan had once held my hand and promised forever. I didn't cry. Not yet. The shock was too complete. When he came home that night, I simply placed the laptop in front of him, open to the messages. His face drained of color. No denials, no excuses, just a quiet, "I'm sorry, Becca. I didn't want you to find out this way." As if there was a good way to discover your husband and sister had betrayed you. The next few weeks passed in a blur of lawyers, custody discussions, and uncomfortable conversations with our children. Jack, at 9, understood more than I wished he did. "Dad loves Aunt Mandy now, but he's supposed to love you," he'd said, his small face scrunched in confusion. Sophie, just 7, kept asking when Daddy was coming home. I had no good answers for either of them. Dan moved out quickly, staying at a hotel before eventually moving in with Mandy at her trendy downtown apartment. They didn't even try to hide their relationship once it was out in the open. 2 months after our separation, they were Facebook official. 3 months in, They were attending family events as a couple while I struggled to get out of bed some mornings. My grandmother Eleanor, Grandma Ellie to everyone in the family, was the first to truly see my pain. At 78, she was the family matriarch, a strong-willed woman who had built a successful antique business with my late grandfather and raised 3 children of her own. She had always been my safe harbor, the wisest person I knew. "Come to dinner on Sunday," she insisted over the phone. "Just you and the kids. Peter will be there too." Uncle Peter, my father's brother, had always been kind to me, though we weren't particularly close. I almost declined. The thought of social interaction when I could barely manage school drop-offs seemed impossible. But something in Grandma Ellie's voice told me this wasn't just about dinner. When we arrived at her Victorian home that Sunday, the familiar scent of her roast chicken and rosemary potatoes enveloped us like a warm hug. Jack and Sophie raced to the backyard where Grandma had set up a new swing set, their laughter floating through the open windows, a sound I hadn't heard nearly enough lately. "Sit," Grandma Ellie commanded, pouring me a glass of wine as Uncle Peter nodded a quiet greeting from across the kitchen. "Now tell me everything, and don't spare the details. I want to know exactly what that grandson-in-law of mine has done." So I told her about the messages, the lies, the humiliation of having to face colleagues and neighbors who knew my sister had taken my husband, about Dan's indifference to how his actions had affected our children, about Mandy's casual cruelty, acting as if she'd done nothing wrong by falling in love with her sister's husband. "And now they want me to babysit their children while they go house hunting," I finished, my voice breaking for the first time since I'd started talking. "As if I'm just supposed to accept all of this and move on." Grandma Ellie's face had grown increasingly stern throughout my story, her normally warm blue eyes turning to ice. "And what about the inheritance?" she asked quietly. I blinked, confused. "What inheritance?" She exchanged a look with Uncle Peter. "The trust fund for your children. The money I set aside for you and Mandy when you each got married. The family business shares." I shook my head. "Grandma, I don't know what you're talking about. Dan and I never received any trust fund." A dark look crossed her face. "That weasel," she muttered. "Daniel convinced me to give him control of your portion 3 years ago. Said he was investing it for your future, for the children's college funds. Mandy got hers too, when she married that first husband of hers." My mind reeled. "How much money are we talking about?" "Enough," Uncle Peter spoke up, his deep voice gentle. "Enough that you shouldn't be worrying about making mortgage payments on a teacher's salary while raising 2 kids alone." I felt like I might be sick. Not only had Dan betrayed me with my sister, but he'd apparently been controlling money that was meant for me and our children, money I never knew existed. "I need to see the paperwork," Grandma Ellie said, standing abruptly. "Peter, call Lawrence. We need to know exactly what Daniel has done with Rebecca's money." Lawrence, I would soon learn, was my grandmother's attorney, and what Daniel had done with my money was invested, but not for my benefit or for our children's future. The trust that should have been worth nearly $300,000 by now had been systematically drained over the past 2 years. Business trips that never happened, investment opportunities that didn't exist, a surprise vacation he'd been planning, likely for him and my sister. As the truth unfolded over the following weeks, I discovered how completely Dan had betrayed me financially as well as emotionally. The severance package from his previous job that supposedly went into our joint savings account, gone. The inheritance from his uncle that was going to pay off our mortgage, non-existent. He'd been living a double life for years, maintaining our comfortable but modest family home while secretly funneling money into hidden accounts and lavish gifts for my sister. "This is why I insisted on prenups for both of you girls when you got married," Grandma Ellie said during one of our now regular Sunday dinners. "Your grandfather and I worked too hard building this family's security to see it squandered." I nodded numbly. The prenup I'd signed, thinking it unnecessary at 23 and madly in love, had actually saved me from financial ruin. Dan couldn't touch the house, which had been purchased with money from my side of the family. He couldn't claim alimony. But the trust fund, the money I'd never known about, that had slipped through the cracks. Summer faded into fall, and I settled into a new routine. Teaching during the day, parenting alone at night. Weekends when the kids visited Dan and Mandy were the hardest. The empty house echoing with silence, reminding me of everything I'd lost. But Sundays at Grandma Ellie's became my anchor, the one place where I felt supported, understood, and strangely enough, empowered. "You'll survive this," she told me one evening as we washed dishes side by side. "Green women always do. Your mother survived losing your father to cancer at 40. I survived the crash of '87 when everyone said the business would fail. You'll not only survive, Becca, you'll thrive." I wanted to believe her. Some days I almost did. Then came the invitation that sent me spiraling again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The annual Green family Christmas gathering at the lake house, a tradition stretching back decades. Every year, the entire extended family spent Christmas Eve and Christmas Day together, exchanging gifts, sharing meals, making memories. "You're obviously still coming," Grandma Ellie said when I called her, panic rising in my throat. "You and the children are family." "But Dan and Mandy will also be there," she finished firmly. "With the rest of the family. You can't hide from them forever, Rebecca." "I'm not hiding," I protested. "I'm protecting myself, my children." "The best protection is holding your head high," she countered. "Besides, I have the big announcement this year, and I want you there for it." The big announcement was another family tradition. Each year, my grandmother used the Christmas gathering to share important family news, business decisions, property acquisitions, sometimes even revealing which antiques in her extensive collection would go to which family member. Last year, she'd announced her semi-retirement, passing day-to-day operations of Green's Antiques to Uncle Peter, while retaining final say on major decisions. "What's the announcement this year?" I asked, curiosity temporarily overriding my anxiety. I could practically hear her smile through the phone. "You'll find out when everyone else does. Christmas Day." As the holiday approached, my dread grew. I shopped for presents on a tighter budget than usual, wrapping them at night after the children were asleep. I baked cookies with Sophie and helped Jack make ornaments for the lake house tree. I did everything a mother should do to make Christmas magical for her children, all while nursing a knot of anxiety that tightened each time I thought about facing Dan and Mandy together, watching them play happy family with my children and our relatives. The week before Christmas, I met my friend Olivia for coffee. We'd been colleagues at Cedarwood Elementary for years, and she was one of the few friends who'd stuck by me without judgment through the whole ordeal. "You don't have to go," she said after I'd vented my fears about the family Christmas. "Your mental health matters too, Becca." "Grandma Ellie insists," I sighed, "and she's been my rock through all of this. I can't let her down." Liv stirred her latte thoughtfully. "Then go and show them exactly what they lost. Get your hair done. Wear that burgundy dress that makes you look amazing. Bring that cranberry walnut bread that everyone fights over. And when Dan or your sister try to engage, be absolutely, devastatingly polite." I laughed for what felt like the first time in months. "Devastatingly polite? Is that even a thing?" "It absolutely is," she insisted. "It's like killing them. With kindness, but with a sharper knife. No tears, no drama, no giving them anything to gossip about later. Just you, looking gorgeous, being gracious, and making them wonder why the hell they ever thought their happiness could come at your expense." It wasn't the worst advice. And as Christmas Eve approached, I found myself embracing Liv's strategy. I booked a hair appointment, splurged on the burgundy dress she'd mentioned, and spent an entire day baking not just my famous cranberry walnut bread, but also the chocolate peppermint cookies that Dan had always loved. Not for him, for me. Because I made the best damn Christmas cookies in Cedarwood, and I wasn't about to stop now. The morning we were set to drive to the lake house, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, applying mascara with a steady hand. That surprised me. The woman staring back looked stronger than I felt, her hair falling in soft waves, her eyes clear despite the months of tears, her shoulders back in quiet determination. "We can do this," I told my reflection. "One day at a time." Jack and Sophie bounded into the bathroom, already dressed in their Christmas outfits, eyes bright with excitement. "Mom, are we leaving soon? Will there be snow at the lake house? Did you pack the presents? Will Daddy be there already?" The questions tumbled out, and I answered each one calmly, marveling at their resilience. "Children adapt," my therapist had told me. "They follow your lead. If you show them stability and love, they'll find their footing, even when the ground has shifted beneath them." As we loaded the car, I took one last look at our house, the home Dan and I had shared, the home he'd walked away from. The Christmas lights twinkled along the roofline. The wreath hung perfectly centered on the front door. It was still home. Different now, quieter perhaps, but still ours. Mine and the children's. The 2-hour drive to the lake house passed quickly, with Christmas music playing and the kids chattering in the back seat. I felt my anxiety rising as we turned onto the familiar gravel road leading to my grandmother's sprawling property. But I took deep breaths, remembering Liv's advice. Devastatingly polite, I could do that. Cars already lined the circular driveway, Uncle Peter's SUV, my cousin's sedans, and there, gleaming in the winter sunlight, Dan's BMW. Parked beside it was a sleek red convertible I recognized as Mandy's. They'd arrived together, of course. The happy couple. "Daddy's here," Sophie squealed, spotting the car immediately. "And Aunt Mandy," Jack added, his voice carrying a note of confusion that broke my heart all over again. I plastered on my best teacher smile, the one I used when a parent was being particularly difficult. "Yes, they're here. Remember what we talked about? We're going to have a wonderful Christmas with the whole family. Everyone will be kind and respectful to each other because that's what families do at Christmas." I didn't add that's what sisters are supposed to do all the time, not steal each other's husbands. Some lessons were better left untaught. We were barely out of the car when the front door of the lake house burst open and Grandma Ellie appeared, wearing her traditional Christmas apron over a festive red sweater, her silver hair swept up in an elegant twist. "There you are," Halinkas called, hurrying down the steps with more energy than many people half her age. I was beginning to worry. The children ran to her, receiving hugs and kisses before racing inside to find their cousins. I followed more slowly, gifts and bags in hand, steeling myself for what awaited. Grandma Ellie pulled me into a fierce hug. "You look beautiful," she whispered, "and stronger than you know." "I'm trying," I whispered back, fighting the emotion that threatened to crack my carefully constructed facade. She stepped back, eyes twinkling with something I couldn't quite identify. "Some things in life are unfair, Becca, but sometimes justice finds its way regardless." Before I could ask what she meant, she was ushering me inside, taking the gifts from my arms, commenting on the wonderful smell of my cranberry bread. And then I was in the great room, with its soaring ceiling draped in garlands, the massive Christmas tree glittering by the windows that overlooked the frozen lake. The fireplace crackled with warmth, stockings hung in a neat row, and gathered around it all was my family, aunts, uncles, cousins, and there, standing by the drinks table, like they belonged Dan and Mandy. My sister spotted me first. She had the audacity to smile, raising her wine glass slightly in my direction. She looked flawless as always, her dark hair falling in perfect waves, her green dress complementing her eyes. Next to her, Dan shifted uncomfortably, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture so familiar it made my stomach clench. He used to touch me that way. I felt Uncle Peter materialize beside me, a glass of wine appearing in my hand. "Chin up," he murmured. "Remember who you are." A green woman, I thought. We survive. We thrive. I took a sip of wine, let the warmth spread through me, and stepped fully into the room. Family members approached one by one, awkward greetings, careful hugs, conversations that danced around the elephant in the room. I played my part perfectly, answering questions about work, commenting on the children's activities, admiring the decorations with appropriate enthusiasm. Dan and Mandy kept their distance initially, which suited me fine. I watched from across the room as they charmed my relatives, as if their relationship hadn't begun in betrayal. Mandy laughed too loudly at someone's joke, her hand possessively on Dan's arm. He looked different somehow. More polished in his expensive sweater, his hair styled in a way I didn't recognize. They looked like a glossy magazine spread, perfect Christmas with the perfect couple. I excused myself to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. Grandma Ellie was there, supervising the feast that was taking shape for tomorrow's Christmas dinner. "They make quite a show of themselves," she observed, nodding toward the great room where Mandy's laughter floated through the doorway. I shrugged, trying for nonchalance. They always did like being the center of attention. Grandma's eyes narrowed slightly. "I've been watching them all afternoon. Something's off." "What do you mean? Too perfect? Too polished? It's like watching actors in a play." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Did you know they put in an offer on the Johnson's Lake property? The one with the boathouse and private dock." I felt myself pale. The Johnson's property was easily worth over $1 million, the most coveted real estate on the lake. How could they possibly afford that? Grandma Ellie's expression turned grim. That's what I've been asking myself. Before I could press further, Sophie burst into the kitchen, breathless with excitement. "Mom! Grandma! Come see! Daddy brought us presents!" My daughter grabbed my hand, tugging me back toward the great room where Dan was indeed distributing beautifully wrapped packages to Jack and Sophie. Large packages. Expensive-looking packages. My children tore into them with abandon, revealing the latest gaming console for Jack and a designer doll collection Sophie had mentioned wanting, once, in passing, months ago. "Do you like them?" Dan asked, his voice carrying that eager-to-please tone he used when he was trying to win approval. When he was trying to buy it. "They're amazing," Jack exclaimed, already examining the console's features. "Can we set it up now?" "At home, honey," I interjected, forcing a smile. "That's too complicated for today." I met Dan's eyes briefly. "Thank you, that was very generous." He shrugged, a flash of something, guilt, defiance, crossing his face. Nothing but the best for my kids. Mandy appeared at his side, her hand sliding into his. "We have something for you too, Becca." She held out a small, wrapped package. I took it automatically, my fingers feeling numb. All around us, conversation had dimmed as family members pretended not to watch this uncomfortable exchange. "You didn't need to get me anything," I said, hating how stiff my voice sounded. "We wanted to," Mandy insisted. "Open it." Under the eyes of my entire family, I had no choice. I carefully removed the wrapping paper to reveal a jewelry box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a heart charm. Engraved on the heart were the words, "Sisters Forever." I stared at it, unable to process the sheer audacity, the complete disconnect from reality. Sisters forever? After she'd taken my husband? After she'd helped destroy my family? My hand closed around the bracelet, metal edges digging into my palm. "It's beautiful," I managed, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Thank you. Put it on, Mandy urged, either oblivious to my discomfort or, more likely, enjoying it. I was saved by Jack, who chose that moment to ask Dan a question about his new game system. As attention shifted away, I slipped the bracelet into my pocket, catching Grandma Ellie's knowing look from across the room. The rest of Christmas Eve passed in a blur of forced cheer and careful navigation. I stayed close to my grandmother, or Uncle Peter, focusing on the children's excitement rather than the painful sight of Dan and Mandy playing happy couple. We had the traditional Green family dinner, sang carols around the piano, and let the children open one small gift each before bed, another family tradition. As I tucked Jack and Sophie into the bunk beds in the room they always used at the lake house, Sophie asked the question I'd been dreading. Mom, why does Daddy love Aunt Mandy now instead of you? I sat on the edge of her bed, smoothing her hair back from her forehead, buying time to find the right words. Sometimes grown-ups' feelings change, sweetheart. It doesn't mean Daddy doesn't love you anymore. But why did he have to leave? Why couldn't he just keep living with us and visit Aunt Mandy sometimes? I felt Jack watching intently from the top bunk, his question unspoken but identical. How could I explain boundaries and betrayal and basic decency to children? When two people are married, I began carefully, they promise to only love each other in a special way. Daddy broke that promise when he started loving Aunt Mandy that way. And when promises that big get broken, sometimes it's better for everyone, if people live in different homes. I hate it, Jack said suddenly, his voice tight with emotion. I hate that he left. I hate that he loves Aunt Mandy now. I know, honey, I said, reaching up to squeeze his hand. It's okay to feel angry. Sometimes. Just remember that none of this is your fault, and both Daddy and I love you very, very much. Does Aunt Mandy love us? Sophie whispered. The question pierced me. Did she? Or were my children just inconvenient accessories that came with the man she'd decided she wanted? I'm sure she cares about you, I said, choosing my words carefully. You're her niece and nephew. This seemed to satisfy Sophie, who snuggled deeper under her blankets. I kissed them both goodnight, turned on their nightlight, and slipped out of the room, emotionally exhausted. The adults were still gathered. In the great room, though the energy had shifted to something quieter, more subdued. Christmas Eve was winding down. I noticed Dan and Mandy sitting close together on the love seat near the fireplace, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. They were talking with my cousin Michael and his wife, all four laughing at something I couldn't hear. I turned away, heading for the kitchen where I found Grandma Ellie arranging cookies on a plate. Midnight snacks for Santa, another family tradition, even though all the children were well past believing. The kids asleep? She asked, offering me a still warm chocolate chip cookie. I nodded, taking the cookie gratefully. Sophie asked why Dan loves Mandy now instead of me. Grandma Ellie's eyebrows rose. What did you tell her? The simplest version of the truth I could manage, I sighed, that sometimes grown-ups' feelings change and promises get broken. Good answer. She set down the spatula she'd been using. You know, I never liked him. I choked on my cookie. What? You always seemed to adore Dan. I tolerated him, she corrected, because you loved him and because he fathered my great-grandchildren. But there was always something about him I didn't trust. Too smooth, too eager to please the right people. She paused. Your grandfather would have seen through him in an instant. I felt tears threatening for the first time that day. I wish I had. Oh, sweetheart. She pulled me into a hug, smelling of cinnamon and comfort. Love blinds us sometimes. That's not your fault. We stood like that for a moment until she pulled back, her expression turning businesslike. Now, I need you to do something for me tomorrow. During the gift exchange, I want you sitting next to me. No arguments. I nodded, too tired to question her. Of course, Grandma. Good. And Rebecca? Her blue eyes fixed on mine, suddenly fierce. Remember that sometimes justice takes time, but it always arrives eventually. With that cryptic statement, she shooed me off to bed, insisting I needed rest for tomorrow's festivities. I retreated to my room, thankfully on the opposite side of the house from wherever Dan and Mandy were staying, and collapsed onto the bed fully dressed, the emotions of the day finally overwhelming me. I must have fallen asleep immediately, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the curtains and excited childish voices were echoing down the hallway. Christmas morning had arrived. I dressed quickly in the red sweater and black pants I'd packed for today, applied minimal makeup, and headed toward the commotion. The scene in the great room was chaotic and joyful, children exclaiming over filled stockings, adults clutching coffee mugs, Christmas music playing softly in the background. Jack and Sophie had already found their stockings and were comparing contents with their cousins. "Merry Christmas, Mom!" Jack called, waving a chocolate Santa in my direction. I smiled, genuinely this time. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Save some candy for after breakfast, okay?" Uncle Peter handed me a steaming mug of coffee, prepared exactly how I liked it. "Sleep well?" "Like the dead," I admitted. "I think the emotional toll of yesterday knocked me out." He nodded sympathetically. "Today will be better, trust me." I wasn't sure what he meant, but the confidence in his voice was reassuring. I scanned the room, noting that Dan and Mandy hadn't appeared yet. Small mercies. Breakfast was the traditional Green family Christmas morning spread. Grandma Ellie's famous cinnamon rolls, egg casserole, fresh fruit, and mimosas for the adults. I helped serve the children, chatted with relatives, and was just starting to relax when Dan and Mandy finally made their entrance. They looked annoyingly well-rested and color-coordinated in complementary shades of green. Mandy's hair was expertly styled despite the early hour, and she wore an emerald necklace I'd never seen before, presumably a Christmas gift from Dan. My ex-husband nodded in my direction but made no move to approach, focusing instead on greeting the children with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Did you see what Santa brought you guys?" he asked, kneeling between Jack and Sophie. "Pretty cool stuff, huh?" "Yeah," Sophie agreed, showing off the art supplies she'd found in her stocking, art supplies I had carefully selected and purchased weeks ago. "Mom says it's because I've been extra good this year." Dan's smile faltered slightly. "That's right, Princess. You've been amazing." I turned away, busying myself with clearing plates, unwilling to watch Dan pretend to be Father of the Year after months of sporadic visitation and missed events. A touch on my arm made me jump. "Don't let him get to you," Uncle Peter murmured. "That's what he wants." I nodded, straightening my shoulders. "I'm fine." "Of course you are," he agreed easily. "You're Eleanor Green's granddaughter." As if summoned by her name, Grandma Ellie appeared, clapping her hands for attention. "Present time in 15 minutes, everyone. Children, help clear the breakfast dishes. Adults, refill your mimosas. We're doing this properly." The gift exchange was another cherished Green family tradition. Everyone gathered in the great room, seated in a rough circle. Presents were distributed one at a time, with each person opening their gift while everyone watched, a way to extend the joy and allow proper appreciation of each item. With nearly 20 family members present, it could take hours, but no one minded. It was Christmas, after all. I found myself directed to the armchair next to my grandmother's place of honor, as she had requested. Uncle Peter sat on her other side, with the children sprawled on the floor nearby, vibrating with anticipation. Dan and Mandy settled onto the sofa directly across from us, creating a perfect line of sight I couldn't avoid. The gift exchange began with the youngest family member, my 4-year-old cousin's daughter, and proceeded by age. Sophie opened a science kit from Uncle Peter, exclaiming over the experiments she could do. Jack received books from his great-aunt Martha and immediately buried his nose in the first volume. The ritual continued, with exclamations of delight, hugs of thanks, and the rustle of wrapping paper creating a festive soundtrack. When it was my turn to open a gift, I selected a soft package from my cousin Sarah. Inside was a beautiful hand-woven scarf in shades of blue that matched my eyes. I thanked her sincerely, wrapping it around my neck to model it for everyone. And then it was Dan's turn. He selected a small package from under the tree, from Mandy, based on the way she squeezed his arm as he opened it. Inside was a set of monogrammed cufflinks that looked absurdly expensive. "These are incredible," he said, leaning over to kiss her lightly. "Thank you, babe." The casual endearment stung more than it should have after all these months, but I kept my expression neutral. Beside me, I felt Grandma Ellie tense slightly. The gift exchange continued around the circle until finally, it was my grandmother's turn. As the eldest, she was traditionally the last to open a present. But instead of reaching for one of the wrapped packages with her name, she stood, commanding the room's attention. "Before I open my gift," she announced, her voice carrying, clearly despite her age, "it's time for this year's family announcement." The room fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. "As you all know," Grandma Ellie continued, "I've been blessed with a wonderful family and a successful business. At my age, one starts thinking about legacy, what we leave behind, and who we leave it to." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, lingering briefly on Dan and Mandy before settling on me. "Last year I announced my semi-retirement from Green's Antiques, with Peter taking over day-to-day operations. This year, I'm announcing changes to my will and the family trust." A ripple of interest moved through the gathering. Wills and trusts weren't typical Christmas conversation, but my grandmother had never been conventional. "I've lived long enough to see people's true characters reveal themselves," she continued. "To witness loyalty and betrayal, honesty and deceit. And I've decided that my legacy will reflect what I've observed." Her voice hardened slightly, and I suddenly understood what was coming. Beside me, Uncle Peter sat straighter, a hint of satisfaction in his expression. "Daniel and Amanda," Grandma Ellie said, fixing them with a steely gaze, "your actions over the past year have demonstrated a profound disrespect for this family's values. Betrayal may be forgiven, but deliberate cruelty and dishonesty cannot." The color drained from Dan's face. Mandy's expression froze in a half-smile, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Daniel," my grandmother continued relentlessly, "you systematically stole from your wife and children, emptying a trust fund intended for their security. Amanda, you betrayed your sister in the most fundamental way possible. Both of you have shown callous disregard for Jack and Sophie's emotional well-being." The room was utterly silent now. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, watching wide-eyed as their great-grandmother delivered her judgment. "Therefore," Grandma Ellie continued, pulling a folder from beside her chair, "I've made the following changes to my will, effective immediately. The lakefront property previously designated for Amanda will now go to Rebecca and her children. The shares in Green's Antiques intended for both Amanda and Daniel are now solely Rebecca's, with a portion held in trust for Jack and Sophie until they turn 25. Mandy made a strangled sound, halfway between a gasp and a protest. Dan's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Furthermore," my grandmother pressed on, seemingly oblivious to their distress, "I've established a new educational trust for Jack and Sophie that cannot be accessed by anyone except them, and only for verifiable educational expenses. This replaces the trust that Daniel misappropriated." She turned to me then, her expression softening. "Rebecca, you've shown remarkable strength and dignity throughout this ordeal. You've put your children first at every turn, despite your own pain. The kind of integrity you've demonstrated is exactly what this family's legacy should represent. I couldn't speak. Tears threatened, but I held them back, aware of all eyes on me. Beside me, Uncle Peter reached over to squeeze my hand supportively. "Now," Grandma Ellie said, turning back to address the entire family. "This announcement is being formalized legally as we speak. My attorney has prepared all the necessary documentation, which will be signed and filed before the new year." "You can't do this!" Dan finally sputtered, finding his voice. "You can't just change everything because you're angry about a divorce. That's not fair." Grandma Ellie fixed him with an icy stare. "What's not fair, Daniel, is stealing from your own children. What's not fair is betraying your wedding vows. What's not fair is the two of you," her gaze included Mandy now, "flaunting your relationship in front of the very people you've hurt, without a shred of remorse." Mandy stood abruptly, her face contorted with anger. "This is ridiculous. You're punishing me for falling in love? For finally being happy? You can't just disinherit me because you don't approve of who I'm with." "I'm not disinheriting you because of who you're with," Grandma Ellie replied calmly. "I'm adjusting my will based on the character you've demonstrated through your actions. The fact that those actions involve Daniel is incidental." "Bullshit!" Mandy exploded, making several relatives gasp at her language. "This is about taking sides. You've always favored Becca, and now you're using your money to punish me." I flinched at the raw hostility in her voice. This was my sister, the girl I'd shared a bedroom with for 15 years, the person who'd been my maid of honor, who'd held my hand through 20 hours of labor when Sophie was born. How had we ended up here? "Amanda Joyce Parker," Grandma Ellie said, her voice suddenly sharp as a blade. "Watch your tone in my house, especially on Christmas Day, especially in front of children." Mandy's mouth snapped shut, but her eyes blazed with fury. "This isn't a courtroom," Grandma Ellie continued. "I'm not required to distribute my assets according to anyone's notion of fairness except my own. You made your choices, and now I've made mine." Dan stood then, placing a restraining hand on Mandy's arm. "This is insane," he said, his voice tightly controlled. "You can't possibly think this will hold up legally. I have rights." "You waived most of them in your divorce settlement," Uncle Peter interjected smoothly. "And the rest are nullified by documentary evidence of financial malfeasance. We have the records, Daniel. All of them." Something flickered in Dan's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that he wasn't going to bluster his way out of this situation. I watched the man I'd once loved, the father of my children, and felt nothing but a profound weariness. "Mom," Jack's small voice broke through the tension, "are you and Dad fighting about money?" All the adults froze. In the drama of the moment, we'd somehow forgotten that the children were witnessing this ugly confrontation. I immediately moved to his side, putting an arm around his shoulders. "No, sweetie," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Grandma Ellie is just making some decisions about family business. It's grown-up stuff, and not something you need to worry about." "But Dad and Aunt Mandy seem really mad," Sophie observed, her lower lip trembling slightly. Dan at least had the grace to look ashamed. He kneeled down, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're not mad, Princess. Just surprised. Sometimes when grown-ups are surprised, they don't react very well. I'm sorry if we scared you." "I think," Grandma Ellie announced, clapping her hands briskly, "that the children should go try out their new gifts while the adults have some coffee. Caroline, would you mind supervising them in the game room?" My cousin Caroline, always quick to read a situation, immediately gathered the children with promises of hot chocolate and Christmas cartoons. Once they were safely out of earshot, the room erupted. "Eleanor, you can't spring something like this on Christmas Day," my Aunt Martha exclaimed. "I think it's perfectly appropriate," Uncle Peter countered. "Christmas is about justice and Redemption, isn't it? This feels more like revenge than justice, someone muttered. I'm calling my lawyer, Mandy announced, pulling out her phone. Feel free, Grandma Ellie replied serenely. Lawrence expected you might, and he's available, all day. His number is in the documentation I've prepared for everyone. She reached into the folder again and began distributing sealed envelopes to various family members. I noticed that Dan and Mandy received significantly thicker packets than everyone else. The full details of the changes are outlined in these materials, she explained. I've included the legal rationale and supporting documentation where relevant. I have nothing to hide. Dan tore open his envelope, scanning the contents. With increasing alarm. You can't, he sputtered, then turned to me accusingly. Did you put her up to this? I had no idea, I said truthfully, still struggling to process everything that had happened in the last 15 minutes. Right, he scoffed. Like you haven't been crying to Grandma about how unfair everything is, playing the victim to get your hands on what should have been ours. Ours? I repeated, anger finally breaking through my shock. There is no ours anymore, Dan. You made sure of that when you moved in with my sister. Don't try to take the moral high ground, Mandy snapped. Our relationship has nothing to do with inheritance or business shares. On the contrary, Grandma Ellie interjected, it has everything to do with it. The Green family legacy isn't just about money or property. It's about values. Loyalty, integrity, responsibility. You've demonstrated none of those qualities. This is ridiculous, Mandy said again, turning to appeal to the other relatives in the room. Can none of you see how unfair this is? She's using her money to punish us for falling in love. An uncomfortable silence fell. No one seemed eager to take sides in what had clearly become a family schism. Finally, my cousin Michael cleared his throat. Look, Mandy, it's not our place to question Grandma's decisions about her own assets. And honestly, the way you two have handled this whole situation... He trailed off, gesturing vaguely. The way we've handled it? Dan repeated incredulously. What were we supposed to do? Stay in unhappy marriages forever just to keep everyone comfortable? No, I said quietly, finding my voice at last. But you could have ended things honorably. You could have told me the truth instead of sneaking around for months. You could have considered how your actions would affect our children. You could have not stolen money that was meant for their future. I didn't steal anything, Dan protested, though his eyes shifted away from mine. I was investing it. In what? Uncle Peter asked pointedly. The Johnson's Lake property? The emerald necklace Amanda's wearing? The trip to Bali you took in September? Dan's face paled. How did you... Bank records, Uncle Peter said simply. Credit card statements, social media posts. It wasn't exactly CSI Miami, Daniel. Mandy turned to me, her expression suddenly calculating. Becca, be reasonable. We can work something out. There's no need for lawyers and drama. We're still family. The audacity of her statement after everything that had happened left me momentarily speechless. She was still trying to manipulate the situation, still convinced she could charm her way out of consequences. Family, I repeated slowly. Is that what we are? Because from where I'm standing, family doesn't betray each other. Family doesn't steal. Family doesn't lie. People make mistakes, she insisted, her tone softening into the persuasive voice she used in her marketing career. Dan and I should have handled things differently, I admit that. But dividing the family like this, turning everyone against us, that's not the answer. I'm not turning anyone against you, I said. Your actions did that all on their own. So self-righteous, Dan muttered. Always the perfect one, aren't you, Becca? Never a mistake, never a wrong move. I laughed then, a short, bitter sound that surprised even me. Perfect? I spent 11 years married to someone who could betray me without a second thought. I trusted my sister when she was sleeping with my husband behind my back. I failed to notice when you were stealing from our children's future. I'd say my judgment has been pretty spectacularly imperfect." The room fell silent again. In the background, I could hear the faint sounds of children's laughter from the game room, the soft melody of Christmas music still playing from somewhere. It all felt surreal, like a scene from someone else's life. "I think," Grandma Ellie said, her voice cutting through the tension, "that we've had enough drama for one Christmas. Daniel, Amanda, you have the documentation explaining my decisions. If you wish to contest them legally, that is your right. But my mind is made up." She turned to the rest of the family. "The rest of you, Christmas dinner will be served at 4. Until then, I suggest we all take some time to collect ourselves." It was a dismissal, clear as day. Family members began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, casting uncertain glances at the fractured remains of what had once been a unified family. I stood frozen, unsure where to go, what to do, how to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. Dan and Mandy remained rooted in place as well, the thick legal packets clutched in their hands, expressions oscillating between shock and rage. Finally, Dan turned to me. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "She won't live forever, and when she's gone—" "Don't," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I'd intended. "Don't threaten me and don't talk about my grandmother that way." "Come on," Mandy said, tugging at Dan's arm. "We need to call Stephen." Stephen was her lawyer friend, a slick corporate attorney who'd handled her first divorce. They stalked out of the room, heads bent together in urgent conversation. As they passed, I caught a fragment of Mandy's whispered words. "Can still contest it if we—" And then they were gone, leaving me alone with Grandma Ellie and Uncle Peter. I collapsed back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. "Well," Uncle Peter said, exhaling heavily, "that went about as expected." "Did it?" I asked faintly. "Because I didn't expect any of this." Grandma Ellie reached over to pat my hand. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, Rebecca. I considered telling you privately beforehand, but I wanted your reaction to be genuine. It was important that everyone see you had no part in my decision." I shook my head, still struggling to process everything. "The lake property? The business shares? Grandma, it's too much. It's what should have been yours all along," she countered firmly. "Daniel's theft of your trust fund was only part of a larger pattern. He and Amanda have been positioning themselves for years, cultivating relationships with key family members, presenting themselves as the natural heirs to the Green legacy." "What?" I looked between her and Uncle Peter in confusion. "Did you know," Uncle Peter asked gently, "that Dan has been having lunch with my CEO, monthly at least, for the past 2 years? Or that Mandy deliberately sought a position with our marketing firm's biggest competitor to gain inside information about our strategies?" I felt sick. No, I had no idea. "They've been playing a long game," Grandma Ellie said, her voice hardening, "using their relationship with this family, with you, to advance their own interests. When Dan realized you weren't ambitious enough, weren't willing to scheme and manipulate for greater wealth or status, he decided you were holding him back." "And Mandy was the convenient alternative," I whispered. "The Parker sister who would play the game his way." "Exactly." Uncle Peter nodded grimly. "We started monitoring their activities after the divorce, when some inconsistencies in company accounts came to light. What we found was concerning." A cold feeling crept up my spine. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Nothing prosecutable, yet," he assured me, "but enough to warrant caution. Dan had been making inquiries about your inheritance potential, about Grandma's will, about the future leadership of Green's Antiques. That's why I accelerated my plans, Grandma Ellie explained. I'd always intended to ensure you and the children were provided for, but after what we discovered, I decided more decisive action was necessary. I sat back, trying to absorb it all. The Dan I thought I knew, the charming financial advisor, the devoted father, the husband who brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning, had been calculating my worth to him all along. And when he'd found me wanting, he'd simply moved on. To the next best option, my sister. They'll contest it, I said finally. You know they will. Let them try, Grandma Ellie replied with serene confidence. Lawrence has prepared for every contingency. And frankly, the more they fight, the more they'll expose about their own actions. Uncle Peter checked his watch. The children will be wondering where everyone went. Should I go reassure them? I nodded gratefully. Please, tell them. Tell them everything is fine, and we'll all have Christmas dinner together as planned. After he left, I turned to my grandmother. Thank you, I said simply. Not just for what you did today, but for seeing the truth when I couldn't. She cupped my cheek gently, her eyes soft with understanding. Loyalty to family doesn't mean blindness to their faults, Rebecca. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is hold people accountable for their actions. I leaned into her touch, allowing myself a moment of vulnerability. I don't know what happens next. Next, she said firmly, we have Christmas dinner. We open the rest of our gifts. We make sure the children have a wonderful holiday despite the drama their parents have created. And tomorrow we begin building the future, a better one, without the dead weight of people who don't deserve your loyalty. Her words were harsh, but somehow comforting in their clarity. For months I'd been struggling to navigate a new reality I never wanted, trying to find my footing in the rubble of my marriage. Now at least, I had a direction. The hours that followed were strange, a surreal attempt at normalcy layered over the tension of the morning's confrontation. Dan and Mandy reappeared for Christmas dinner, subdued but present, presumably for the children's sake. They sat at the far end of the table, speaking only when directly addressed, occasionally exchanging whispered comments or meaningful glances. The rest of the family made a valiant effort at festive conversation, discussing safe topics like recent movies or the children's school activities. Uncle Peter kept the wine flowing freely, which helped ease the awkwardness somewhat. I focused on Jack and Sophie, making sure they had everything they needed, laughing at their jokes, helping them navigate the complex array of utensils at Grandma Ellie's formal table setting. It was during dessert, Grandma's famous chocolate, Yule log, that the facade finally cracked again. Sophie had just finished telling everyone about her school's winter concert, where she'd had a small solo. I recorded it on my phone, I said, smiling at her proud little face. She was amazing. I wish I could have been there, Dan said, his voice carrying clearly down the table. If someone had told me about it. I stiffened, feeling all eyes turn our way. I sent you an email with all the December school events back in November. It was on the shared calendar, too. I never got any email, he countered. And you changed the calendar password. No, I didn't, I said, working to keep my voice even. The school sends automatic updates to both parent emails on file. Sophie looked between us, her expression crumpling. It's okay, Daddy. I was really nervous anyway. I'm sure you were wonderful, sweetheart, Mandy interjected with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. Maybe you could sing for us after dinner? Before Sophie could respond, Jack spoke up. Mom recorded it because she knew Dad wouldn't come. He never comes to anything anymore. The bluntness of children. I closed my eyes briefly, wishing we could have avoided this conversation, especially today. That's not true, buddy, Dan protested. I've been really busy with work, and sometimes I don't get the information I need to be there. You came to Emily's dance recital, Jack pointed out, naming my sister's daughter. You were sitting right next to Aunt Mandy. I saw the pictures on her Facebook. Silence fell across the table. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed. I had seen those pictures too. Dan beaming proudly beside my niece as if he were a devoted uncle, rather than someone who regularly missed his own children's events. Perhaps, Grandma Ellie said smoothly, this isn't the best time for this discussion. Who would like more dessert? But Dan wasn't ready to let it go. So now I'm being criticized. For supporting my niece? For trying to maintain relationships with family despite the divorce? No one's criticizing you, I said quietly. Jack was just making an observation. An observation fed by your constant attempts to make me look bad, Dan shot back. Dad, Mom doesn't say bad things about you, Jack insisted, his face flushing with emotion. She always says we should respect you even when you don't come to stuff. I placed a gentle hand on Jack's shoulder. It's okay, honey. Let's talk about something else. Why? Mandy challenged suddenly. Why should we pretend everything's fine when it's clearly not? You've turned the children against us, convinced Grandma to disinherit us, and now we're supposed to just eat Christmas dessert like one big happy family? Amanda, Uncle Peter warned, not in front of the children. They should know what their mother is doing, Mandy exclaimed. Using them as pawns to get sympathy, to get money. That's enough, I interrupted, standing abruptly. Jack, Sophie, please go to the game room. Now. They hesitated, wide-eyed at the tension crackling around the table. Go on, Grandma. Ellie encouraged gently. Take your cousins, too. There's a new puzzle in the cabinet you might enjoy. Once the children had reluctantly filed out, I turned to face my sister and ex-husband. I have never, not once, spoken negatively about either of you to my children. I have bent over backwards to maintain their relationship with their father, despite his indifference. I have swallowed my pain and anger to ensure they don't carry the burden of adult problems. Oh, please, Mandy scoffed. The perfect martyr act is getting old, Becca. It's not an act, Uncle Peter said sharply. Some of us have actually been present, Amanda. We've seen Rebecca pick up the pieces while you two play house with money that isn't yours. This family has clearly made its choice, Dan said bitterly, backing Rebecca no matter what, refusing to even consider our side of things. What exactly is your side? My cousin Michael asked, sounding genuinely curious. That you were justified in cheating with your wife's sister? That taking money meant for your children was somehow okay? Dan flushed darkly. You don't know anything about our marriage. Rebecca and I were practically roommates toward the end, and I never intended to keep that money. It was a temporary reallocation for investments that would have benefited everyone. Investments like the Johnson property? Uncle Peter inquired innocently. The one you and Amanda put an offer on last month? How exactly would that have benefited Rebecca and the children? Mandy shot Dan an alarmed look, clearly unaware that this information was known to the family. We're done here, Dan announced, throwing his napkin on the table. Come on, Amanda. We don't have to sit here and be attacked. What about the children? I asked as they both stood. It's Christmas Day. You're just going to leave? Dan hesitated, looking torn for the first time. I'll call them tomorrow. We can do something special next weekend. And with that, they walked out, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. I sank back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. Well, Aunt Martha said after a moment, that was certainly the most dramatic Christmas dinner we've ever had. A ripple of nervous laughter broke the tension. Family members began talking again, deliberately light and casual, as if trying to reestablish normalcy. I participated mechanically, smiling when appropriate, answering questions directed my way. But inside, I felt hollowed out. Later, after the children were in bed and most of the family had retreated to their rooms or headed home, I found myself sitting alone on the dock behind the lake house. The night was clear and cold, stars reflected in the frozen surface of the lake. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself, watching my breath form clouds in the crisp air. Footsteps on the wooden planks announced Uncle Peter's arrival. He handed me a steaming mug, hot chocolate laced with something stronger, based on the smell. "Thought you might need this," he said, settling beside me. I accepted it gratefully, letting the warmth seep into my cold hands. What a day. Indeed? He took a sip from his own mug. "How are you holding up?" I considered the question seriously. I don't know. Shocked, angry, relieved in a way, sad for the children. All perfectly reasonable reactions. We sat in companionable silence, for a while sipping our spiked cocoa, watching the stars. Finally, I voiced the thought that had been nagging at me since the confrontation. "Do you think I'm partly responsible? For how things turned out with Dan? With Mandy?" Uncle Peter turned to me, his expression thoughtful in the dim light from the house windows. "Do you mean, did you somehow cause them to behave dishonestly and cruelly? No, absolutely not. But maybe if I'd been different, more ambitious, more exciting, more like Mandy." "Stop," he said firmly. "That's a road. That leads nowhere good. Dan chose to betray you rather than address whatever issues existed in your marriage. Mandy chose to pursue her sister's husband rather than respect family bonds. Those choices reflect their character, not yours." I nodded slowly, wanting to believe him. It's just, when someone leaves you for someone else, it's hard not to compare yourself, to wonder what they have that you don't. What Mandy has is a fundamental selfishness that allows her to take what she wants without regard for who gets hurt. Is that really something you wish you had? Put that way, it sounded ridiculous. No, of course not. The measure of a person isn't in what they accumulate, money, partners, status, Uncle Peter continued. It's in how they respond to life's challenges. By that metric, Rebecca, you're worth 10 of them. His words warmed something inside me that had been cold for months. Thank you for saying that. It's just the truth. He drained his mug and stood. Don't stay out too long, it's freezing. After he left, I remained on the dock, thinking about what he'd said. For so long, I'd been defining myself in relation to what I'd lost. My marriage, my sister, my sense of security. But maybe it was time to start thinking about what I'd gained, or could gain, from this painful chapter. Independence, clarity, a chance to model resilience for my children, a deeper understanding of which relationships in my life were genuine and which were conditional. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but for the first time since Dan left, I felt a flicker of possibility rather than just loss. The drive home from the lake house the next day was quieter than the journey there. Jack and Sophie were subdued, processing in their own ways the drama they had witnessed. I kept the Christmas music playing, maintaining a cheerful facade for their sake. But my mind was racing with all that had transpired. "Mom," Jack said eventually, "are Dad and Aunt Mandy in trouble? With Grandma Ellie, I mean." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, choosing my words carefully. Grandma Ellie made some decisions that Dad and Aunt Mandy weren't happy about. Grown-up decisions about money and property. "Because they did bad things?" Sophie asked, her voice small. I sighed. There was no perfect way to answer this. They made choices that hurt our family, and Grandma Ellie believes those choices should have consequences. Like when I don't do my homework and lose screen time, Jack suggested. Something like that, I agreed, grateful for his simplification. Actions have consequences, even for adults. Sophie twisted the hem of her sweater anxiously. "Is Aunt Mandy still our aunt?" "Of course she is," I assured her, though the words tasted bitter. "Nothing changes the fact that she's my sister and your aunt." "But we won't see her as much now, right?" Jack pressed. I hesitated. That might be true, at least for a while. Sometimes when adults have disagreements, they need some space from each other. Like you and Dad needed space, and that's why he left? Sophie's innocent question pierced straight to my heart. Not exactly, sweetheart. That was different. How could I explain the complexities of adult relationships to a 7-year-old? The important thing to remember is that none of this is your fault, and all the adults in your life love you very much. This seemed to satisfy them for the moment, and they turned their attention to the tablets I'd allowed them to use for the drive home. I returned to my own thoughts, wondering what the coming days would bring. Would Dan follow through on his threats to contest Grandma Ellie's decisions? Would Mandy try to reach out to repair our relationship now that money was involved? How would I manage co-parenting with a man who had made his hostility so clear? By the time we arrived home, darkness had fallen. The house looked just as we'd left it, Christmas lights twinkling welcomingly. Inside, however, it felt different somehow, as if the events at the lake house had altered something fundamental about our living space, or perhaps about me. "Can we have pizza for dinner?" Jack asked as we hauled our bags inside. "Sure," I agreed easily. "It's still Christmas break. We can bend the rules a little." While the children unpacked and sorted through their Christmas haul, I ordered dinner and checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Mandy, a text from Dan asking to speak with the children, and several messages from family members checking in after the dramatic holiday. I decided the calls and texts could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was for regrouping, for creating a peaceful evening after the emotional turbulence of Christmas. Over pizza and ice cream, we watched a movie together, all piled onto the living room sofa under blankets. Both kids fell asleep before the end, exhausted from the excitement and tension of the past 2 days. I carried Sophie to bed first, then gently woke Jack enough to guide him to his room, tucking him in with a kiss on his forehead. Alone in the quiet house, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. There were practical matters to address now, understanding exactly what Grandma Ellie's announcements meant for our future, preparing for the legal battles that likely lay ahead, figuring out how to navigate the new family dynamics. I opened the envelope Grandma had given me, spreading out the documents inside. The legal language was dense, but the implications were clear. I was now a significant shareholder in Green's Antiques, with a seat on the board if I wanted it. The trust for Jack and Sophie was substantial, enough to ensure they could attend any college they chose without financial stress. And the lake property, a beautiful piece of shoreline adjacent to the family house, was now in my name. It was overwhelming. I had gone from worrying about making ends meet on a teacher's salary to having significant assets overnight. The financial security was a relief, of course, but it came with complications I hadn't anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "How did Christmas go? Call me when you can." I hesitated, then decided I needed a friendly ear. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, you survived," she greeted me cheerfully. "Was it as awful as you feared? Worse and better. It's complicated." I took a deep breath. My grandmother basically disowned Dan and Mandy and gave everything to me and the kids instead. There was a moment of stunned silence. "Holy crap, Becca. Are you serious?" "Completely." She announced it in front of the entire family on Christmas Day. There was a scene. Dan and Mandy left. It was incredibly dramatic. "Wow," Olivia breathed. I don't even know what to say. Are you okay?" "I'm still processing," I admitted. On one hand, I'm relieved about the financial security. On the other hand, I know this is just the beginning of a whole new battle with Dan and Mandy. "Let them fight," Olivia said fiercely. "They've taken enough from you. If your grandmother wants you to have these things, that's her choice." "I know, but—" I sighed, struggling to articulate my discomfort. "I never wanted any of this, Liv. I just wanted my family to stay intact. I wanted my marriage to work. I wanted my sister to be my sister, not my rival. Of course you did, she said gently. You're a good person who got hurt by selfish people, but now you have a chance to rebuild on your terms, with real security for you and the kids. I guess you're right. I took a sip of wine, considering her perspective. It's just a lot to take in. One day at a time, she advised. You don't have to figure everything out tonight. After we hung up, I sat with my thoughts for a while longer. One day at a time. It was the same advice I'd been following since Dan left. The only way to navigate grief and upheaval without becoming overwhelmed. But now the days ahead looked different, filled with new possibilities as well as new challenges. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone ringing. Dan's name flashed on the screen. I considered ignoring it, but eventually decided that avoidance wouldn't solve anything. Hello? I answered, keeping my voice neutral. We need to talk, he said without preamble, about what happened at your grandmother's. Good morning to you too, Dan. He sighed impatiently. Can we be adults about this, please? This is serious. I'm aware, I replied. But I'm not having this conversation while the children are awake. They've witnessed enough tension already. Fine, he conceded. When can we meet? Today? I can't do today. I'm taking the kids ice skating, and then we're having dinner with friends. A small lie. We had no firm plans yet, but I needed time to prepare for whatever confrontation he was planning. Tomorrow, then. Coffee at Riverside Cafe, 10 a.m. Fine, I agreed. I'll be there. After hanging up, I checked my messages and found 3 more from Mandy, each increasingly desperate in tone. We need to talk about what Grandma did. This isn't fair, Becca. Call me back. Are you really going to let her do this? I'm your sister. The last one made me laugh out loud, though there was no humor in it. Now she remembered our sisterhood? After months of flaunting her relationship with my husband, after helping him hide money meant for our children, after deliberately excluding us from family gatherings she'd organized, now she wanted to invoke the sacred bond of sisters. I deleted the messages without responding. Whatever Mandy and Dan had to say could wait until our coffee meeting tomorrow. Today was for my children, for creating some semblance of normalcy after the chaos of Christmas. Mom, can we go sledding? Jack asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway still in his pajamas, hair sticking up in all directions. It's not really snowy enough for sledding, I pointed out, glancing through the window at the light dusting that had fallen overnight. But we could go ice skating at the winter festival downtown. Would you like that? His face lit up. Yeah. And can we get hot chocolate with the little marshmallows? Absolutely, I promised. Go wake your sister and get dressed. We'll have breakfast and then head out. The Cedarwood Winter Festival was an annual tradition, transforming the town square into a wonderland of twinkling lights, vendor booths, and activities. The centerpiece was a large outdoor skating rink that operated throughout the holiday season. In previous years, we'd always gone as a family, Dan holding Sophie's hand while she wobbled on her skates, Jack racing ahead to show off his speed. Today would be different, but I was determined to make it special. I layered the kids in warm clothes, packed extra gloves and scarves, and drove downtown with Christmas music playing on the car radio. The festival was crowded, families taking advantage of the school break to enjoy the holiday attractions. We rented skates and made our way onto the ice, Sophie clinging to my hand, Jack testing his balance with cautious steps. Remember when Dad fell last year and tore his pants? Jack said suddenly, laughing at the memory. Everyone could see his Christmas tree underwear. I smiled, the memory bittersweet. He was pretty embarrassed. But he kept skating anyway, Sophie added. He said it was worth it to skate with us. These small reminders appeared constantly, little landmines of nostalgia that exploded when least expected. I had learned not to dodge them, not to change the subject when the children mentioned their father in happier contexts. Those memories were theirs to keep, untarnished by adult complications. "Look who's here!" a familiar voice called out. I turned to see Olivia gliding toward us, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I was hoping I'd run into you guys." "Liv!" Sophie squealed with delight. My friend was a favorite with both children, bringing them small treats and always taking an interest in their activities. "I didn't know you'd be here," I said, genuinely surprised. She winked. "Thought you might need backup for your plans. With friends today." I smiled gratefully. Olivia had understood my need for a buffer, for company, for something to fill the day that might otherwise have been consumed by rumination over Dan and Mandy's machinations. "Who wants to race to the other side?" she challenged, and Jack immediately accepted, the two of them taking off across the ice while Sophie and I followed more slowly. The morning passed in a blur of skating, hot chocolate with mini marshmallows as promised, and browsing the festival booths. At lunchtime, we ducked into a cafe to warm up, ordering sandwiches and soup. "Thanks for joining us," I told Olivia while the kids were preoccupied with the cafe's small toy corner. "I think I really needed the distraction." "Anytime," she said warmly. "So, coffee with Dan tomorrow? What's your game plan?" I shrugged. "Listen to whatever demands or threats he wants to make, then tell him I need to consult my lawyer before agreeing to anything." "You have a lawyer?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not specifically, but Grandma Ellie's attorney, Lawrence, called this morning and offered his services. Apparently, she instructed him to provide whatever legal support I need on her dime." Olivia grinned. "Your grandmother is officially my hero." "She's something else," I agreed. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything she's done." "Are you worried? About tomorrow, I mean." I considered the question. Not worried exactly, more resigned. This is just the beginning of what will probably be a lengthy battle. "You'll win," Olivia said confidently. "The truth is on your side." I hoped she was right, but experience had taught me that truth didn't always prevail, at least not cleanly or easily. Dan and Mandy were resourceful, determined, and now desperate. That made them dangerous. But I pushed those thoughts aside for now, focusing instead on enjoying the rest of our day at the festival. We watched an ice sculpture competition, listened to a children's choir singing carols, and bought caramel apples from a vendor who dipped them in chocolate and sprinkles while we watched. By the time we headed home, dusk was falling. The children were happily exhausted, their faces flushed from the cold and excitement. As I tucked them into bed that night, earlier than usual due to their yawns and heavy eyelids, I felt a rare sense of accomplishment. Despite everything, I had given them a good day. The next morning, I dropped Jack and Sophie at a neighbor's house. Their daughter Emma was a friend from school, and drove to the Riverside Cafe with a knot of tension forming in my stomach. Dan was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with 2 coffee cups in front of him. "You remembered how I take my coffee," I observed as I slid into the seat across from him. 11 years of marriage," he replied with a shrug. "Some things stick." I took a sip, gathering my thoughts. Dan looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from stress rather than lack of sleep. His usual polished appearance was slightly disheveled, shirt not quite pressed, stubble a day past intentionally fashionable. "Where's Mandy?" I asked. "I thought it would be better if we talked alone first." He ran a hand through his hair. "Look, Becca, about what happened at Christmas." "Let me guess," I interrupted. "You want me to intervene with Grandma Ellie, to convince her to change her mind, to make everything fair again?" His jaw tightened. "Is that so unreasonable? This affects more than just us. It affects the children, the entire family dynamic." "Yes, it does," I agreed. "Just like your affair with my sister affected more than just us. Just like your theft from the children's trust affected more than just us. Actions have consequences, Dan. Isn't that what you always told Jack?" "That's not..." He broke off, visibly restraining himself. I didn't come here to fight. I came to propose a solution that works for everyone. I'm listening. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Amanda and I are willing to drop any legal challenge to Eleanor's changes if you agree to a fair division. The lake property stays with you and the kids, but we get a portion of the business shares, say 20% each. That still leaves you as the majority shareholder, but gives us some stake in the family business. I stared at him, incredulous. You're negotiating? After everything you've done, you think you deserve a fair division of assets that were never yours to begin with? We're still family, he insisted. Whether you like it or not, Amanda is still Eleanor's granddaughter. I'm still the father of your children. Family, I repeated slowly. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. A flicker of surprise crossed his face at the movie reference. We had watched The Princess Bride countless times together before his expression hardened again. Be reasonable, Rebecca. A legal battle will be messy, expensive, and public. Do you really want the children to see their parents fighting over money and property? Don't, I said sharply. Don't use the children as leverage. You lost that right when you drained their college fund to woo my sister. He flinched, a small confirmation that Uncle Peter's accusations had been accurate. That's not, I was planning to replenish it. With what? The money from selling the lake property you were trying to buy? The property that, by the way, would have given you control over access to the family lake house? Was that part of your long game too? Dan's eyes narrowed. You've been talking to Peter. Peter, Grandma Ellie, Lawrence. I've been learning quite a lot about your activities over the past few years. Things I was too trusting, too blind to see while we were married. He sat back, reassessing me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. You've changed. Yes, I agreed simply. I had to. We stared at each other across the table, the remains of our marriage laid bare between us. I had loved this man once, had built my world around him, had believed in the life we were creating together. Now he felt like a stranger, someone I had never really known at all. So what happens now? He asked finally. You get everything, and Amanda and I get nothing? You get exactly what Grandma Ellie decided you deserve, which is more than you would have gotten if the legal system were fully aware of your financial manipulations. I gathered my purse, preparing to leave. I won't be intervening on your behalf, Dan. Any communication about this should go through Lawrence from now on. This isn't over, he warned as I stood. Amanda won't accept being cut out of her inheritance. She'll fight. Let her, I said, surprising myself with my calm certainty. I'm done being the peacekeeper, the reasonable one, the sister who sacrifices to keep everyone happy. Tell Mandy if she wants to talk to me, she can call like a grown-up instead of sending manipulative texts. I walked out of the cafe with my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. It was the first time I'd stood up to Dan directly, without hedging, or apologizing or trying to smooth things over. It felt terrifying and exhilarating all at once. My phone rang almost as soon as I got to my car. Mandy. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message as I drove to pick up the children. Becca, this is ridiculous. We're sisters. We need to work this out without lawyers and drama. Call me back, please. Her voice held that familiar note of calculated vulnerability, the one she'd used since childhood to get her way. It had worked on our parents, on teachers, on boyfriends, and yes, often on me. But not today. Instead of calling her back, I texted, If you want to talk, I'll be at Grandma Ellie's tomorrow at 2 p.m. You can meet me there. The response came immediately. Why at Eleanor's? Because I want a neutral third party present and she deserves to hear whatever you have to say. There was a long pause before her next message appeared. Fine. See you then. I picked up Jack and Sophie, thanked my neighbor for watching them, and drove home feeling strangely light despite the confrontations ahead. For the first time in months, I was setting the terms of engagement rather than reacting to Dan and Mandy's moves. That evening, after the children were in bed, I called Grandma Ellie to tell her about the meeting I'd arranged. "Are you sure that's wise?" she asked. "Amanda is. Well, she's always been persuasive when she wants something." "I know," I acknowledged. "That's why I want you there, to keep me strong and to hear firsthand whatever she proposes." "All right," she agreed. "But I want Peter there too, and Lawrence." I hesitated. "Isn't that a bit intimidating? 4 against 1? "Exactly," she said with satisfaction. "Amanda needs to understand that the days of manipulating this family are over. She's not walking into a negotiation, she's walking into an accountability session." I smiled despite myself. My grandmother had never been one for half measures. The next afternoon, I drove to Grandma Ellie's house with a curious mix of dread and anticipation. Uncle Peter's car was already in the driveway, along with an expensive-looking sedan I assumed belonged to Lawrence. Grandma greeted me with a warm hug. "You look well," she observed. "Stronger." "I feel stronger," I admitted. "Scared, too, but in a different way than before." She nodded approvingly. Fear can be useful when it sharpens rather than paralyzes. Uncle Peter and Lawrence were waiting in the formal living room, an elegant space rarely used except for important occasions. Lawrence was exactly as I'd imagined from our phone conversation, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with shrewd eyes behind expensive glasses. "Rebecca," he greeted me, shaking my hand firmly. "Good to meet you in person. I've prepared some documentation that might be useful during today's discussion." He gestured to a leather portfolio on the coffee table. "Financial records, timelines of suspicious activities, communications between Daniel and Amanda dating back 3 years. Nothing we would use in court unless absolutely necessary, but good leverage for today's conversation." I blinked, taken aback by how thoroughly they had been monitoring my ex-husband and sister. "How did you get all this?" "Lawrence has resources," Uncle Peter said simply. "And your grandmother has been concerned about Daniel's intentions for longer than you know." Before I could question this further, the doorbell rang. Grandma Ellie straightened her shoulders. "Showtime," she said with grim satisfaction. Mandy looked taken aback when Grandma's housekeeper showed her into the living room and she saw the assembled group. She faltered briefly in the doorway before her natural confidence reasserted itself. "I thought we were having a private conversation." "Becca," she said, her tone accusatory. "You thought wrong," I replied calmly. "Please, have a seat." She hesitated, then perched on the edge of an armchair, her posture defensive. "I don't understand why this has to be so formal. We're family. We should be able to talk things through." "That's exactly what we're doing," Grandma Ellie said smoothly. "Talking things through, with appropriate witnesses, given recent events." Mandy's gaze flitted between us, calculating. "Is this some kind of intervention? Because I haven't done anything wrong? Falling in love isn't a crime." "No, but financial fraud is," Lawrence interjected mildly. "As is misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and several other activities we've documented over the past 3 years. The color drained from Mandy's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Uncle Peter said. "But we're not here to discuss potential criminal charges. Not today, anyway. We're here because you wanted to talk to Rebecca about Eleanor's recent decisions regarding the family assets." Mandy rallied quickly, turning to me with an expression of wounded sisterly affection. "Becca, this isn't right. Whatever issues you have with me and Dan, cutting me out of my inheritance is vindictive and unfair. Grandma is punishing me for falling in love, and you're letting it happen." I had expected to feel a surge of anger at her framing of the situation, but instead I felt oddly calm, almost detached. This person sitting across from me, was she really the sister I had grown up with? Had she always been this manipulative, this self-centered, and I'd simply been too loyal to notice? "This isn't about you falling in love," I said quietly. "This is about the choices you and Dan made, and how those choices hurt other people, specifically my children, your niece and nephew." "I would never hurt Jack and Sophie," she protested. "I love them." "Yet you helped Dan hide money that was meant for their future," Uncle Peter observed. "You knew about the trust fund. You knew he was diverting those funds for your benefit. The trips, the jewelry, the lake property." "That's not," she began, then stopped abruptly, reconsidering her approach. "Look, I may have made some mistakes in how Dan and I handled things, but cutting me out of the family business, taking away property that should have been mine, that's not proportional." "It's not punishment, Amanda," Grandma Ellie said firmly. "It's a consequence. I didn't build this family's security to have it squandered by people who don't share our values." "Values?" Mandy repeated incredulously. "Since when is the Green family some kind of moral authority?" "Dad cheated on Mom for years before they divorced. Uncle Richard has had 3 wives, and now you're all sitting in judgment of me?" "This isn't about judgment," I said, keeping my voice level despite the painful reminder of our father's infidelities. "It's about accountability. You and Dan made choices that hurt people. Real, tangible harm. Now you're facing consequences for those choices." "So that's it?" she demanded, anger beginning to override her calculated approach. "You get everything and I get nothing because I fell in love with the wrong person?" "Not nothing," Lawrence interjected, opening his portfolio. "Eleanor has established a small trust in your name, approximately 15% of what Rebecca and the children will receive. It's contingent on several conditions, however." Mandy's eyes narrowed. "What conditions?" Grandma Ellie leaned forward, her gaze steady. "First, you and Daniel cease all legal challenges to my estate planning decisions. Second, Daniel returns the funds he diverted from the children's original trust, with interest. Third, you both sign agreements acknowledging your actions and waiving any future claims. And if I refuse? Then we proceed with a full legal and potentially criminal investigation into the financial irregularities we've documented," Lawrence said matter-of-factly. "Which, I should note, would almost certainly impact Daniel's professional standing and licensure as a financial advisor." The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. Dan's entire career could be destroyed if the extent of his financial misconduct became public knowledge. Mandy's expression shifted from defiance to calculation as she processed this reality. "I need to discuss this with Dan," she said finally, "and our own attorney." "Of course," Lawrence agreed smoothly. "I've prepared copies of the relevant documentation for your review." He handed her a sealed envelope. "You have 1 week to make your decision." "1 week?" she protested. "That's not enough time for something this significant." "1 week," Grandma Ellie repeated firmly. "This has dragged on long enough. I want it resolved before the new year." Mandy stood, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. For a moment she looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. Then her eyes met mine, and I glimpsed something I'd rarely seen from my confident, self-assured sister. Fear. "Becca," she said softly. "Can we talk? Just us?" I hesitated, looking to Grandma Ellie, who gave a slight nod. 5 minutes, I agreed. "We can use the sunroom." The sunroom was my favorite space in Grandma's house, a glass-enclosed sanctuary overlooking the garden, filled with plants and comfortable wicker furniture. In summer, it was almost tropical. In winter, with the heaters running, it remained a green oasis against the gray landscape outside. Mandy paced the small space while I settled onto a cushioned chair, watching her warily. "This is insane," she burst out finally. "All of it. The The lawyers, the threats, the ultimatums. We're sisters, Becca. Sisters fight, they hurt each other sometimes, but they don't do this. She gestured vaguely toward the living room we'd left. What exactly did you expect? I asked quietly. That you could sleep with my husband, help him steal from my children, exclude us from family events, and I'd just… What? Get over it. Accept it as some kind of sisterly disagreement. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she insisted, her eyes filling with tears that looked genuine for once. Dan and I… It wasn't planned. We connected at a time when we were both struggling and things just… developed. Things don't just develop, Mandy. People make choices. You made choices. Dan made choices. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices. So that's it? No forgiveness? No second chances? Just punishment and retribution? A tear slipped down her cheek, and she wiped it away angrily. I thought you were better than that. The accusation stung, poking at my lifelong tendency to be the reasonable one, the peacemaker, the sister who forgave and forgot. For a moment, I wavered. Maybe I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. Then I remembered Jack asking why his father could attend his cousin's dance recital, but not his basketball game. I remembered Sophie crying because she couldn't understand why Aunt Mandy didn't want to see her anymore. I remembered the casual cruelty of their Christmas celebration without us. This isn't about punishment, I said finally. It's about boundaries. For the first time in my life, I'm setting clear boundaries about how I deserve to be treated and what I will accept from people who claim to love me. And what about how you're treating me? She countered. Cutting me off from my inheritance. Threatening Dan's career, those aren't boundaries, Becca. That's revenge. The inheritance was never yours to begin with. It was Grandma's to distribute as she saw fit. As for Dan's career, he endangered that himself when he chose to misappropriate funds. I stood up, done with the conversation. Your 5 minutes are up. Talk to Dan, talk to your lawyer, make your decision. But understand this. I'm not intervening on your behalf. Not this time. Her expression hardened, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. You'll regret this. When the dust settles and you're alone with 2 kids and a pile of money you never earned, you'll regret choosing bitterness over family. Maybe, I acknowledged. But right now, I'm choosing peace over chaos, honesty over manipulation, and my children's well-being over your comfort. That feels like the right decision, even if it's not an easy one. I left her standing in the sunroom, returning to the living room where Grandma Ellie, Uncle Peter, and Lawrence waited expectantly. She'll take the deal, I said with certainty. She can't risk Dan losing his license. That would destroy their lifestyle too completely. Lawrence nodded, satisfied. I thought as much. We should hear from them within the week. As predicted, 3 days later, Mandy and Dan accepted Grandma Ellie's terms. The papers were signed, the funds were transferred, and just like that, the legal battle I'd been dreading was averted before it truly began. I should have felt triumphant, or at least relieved. Instead, I felt a curious emptiness, as if something fundamental had been lost along with the conflict. In a way, it had. My sister was effectively out of my life now, our relationship damaged beyond any foreseeable repair. My marriage was long over, of course, but now even the pretense of an amicable co-parenting relationship seemed impossible. You did the right thing, Olivia assured me over coffee a few days later, after I'd confessed my mixed feelings about the resolution. You protected yourself and your kids. That's what matters. I know, I sighed. I just never imagined my life turning out this way. Divorced at 34, estranged from my only sibling, raising 2 kids essentially alone. Not alone, she corrected firmly. You have your grandmother, your uncle, friends who love you. And now you have financial security too. That counts. For a lot. She was right, of course. The settlement had transformed my financial situation overnight. I no longer needed to worry about mortgage payments or whether I could afford summer camps for the kids. The seat on the board of Green's Antiques came with a generous stipend, though Uncle Peter assured me my actual duties would be minimal until I felt ready to take a more active role. The lake property was perhaps the most unexpected gift. Few weeks after the settlement, Uncle Peter took me to see it. 5 acres of pristine lakefront with a small, well-maintained cabin that had once been a caretaker's residence for the main family property. "It's beautiful," I breathed, standing on the wooden dock that extended into the clear blue water. I had no idea this was what Grandma meant by the lakefront property. "She's owned it for decades," Uncle Peter explained. "Been holding on to it for the right person. She always said it had special energy, creative energy. I could feel it too. Something peaceful yet invigorating about the place. The cabin itself was rustic but solid, with a large main room whose windows framed the lake like a living painting. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a simple kitchen occupied another. 2 small bedrooms and a surprisingly modern bathroom completed the space. "It needs some updating," Uncle Peter acknowledged. "But the bones are good. You could make it a weekend retreat, or even live here full-time if you wanted. The school district is excellent." I tried to imagine it. Mornings, waking to the sound of lapping water. Evenings watching the sunset over the lake, the children growing up with nature as their playground. It was tempting, but also intimidating. A completely fresh start in a new place. "I'll think about it," I told him. "For now, maybe we can come up on weekends, see how it feels." That became our new routine as winter melted into spring. Fridays. After school, I'd pack the kids into the car and drive to the lake cabin, where we'd spend the weekend hiking, reading, playing board games, or simply sitting on the dock watching for wildlife. Jack discovered an interest in fishing, while Sophie filled sketchbook after sketchbook with drawings of trees, birds, and water. Dan's visitation schedule continued. He would pick them up from school every other Wednesday and return them Friday afternoon, and they spent one weekend a month at his and Mandy's new condo downtown. He remained civil but distant with me, our communication limited to logistics about the children. Mandy I didn't see at all. Grandma Ellie visited the cabin, often, sometimes staying overnight, delighting in the children's growing comfort with nature. "This place is good for all of you," she observed one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the kids chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I can see the change in you, Rebecca. You're coming back to yourself." It was true. Something about the lake, the cabin, the rhythm of our weekends there was healing me in ways I hadn't expected. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest since finding Dan's messages had gradually loosened. I slept better, laughed more easily, found myself dreaming again of possibilities rather than just surviving each day. By late spring, I had made my decision. "I want to move to the cabin full-time," I told Grandma Ellie over lunch at her house, "before the new school year starts, so the kids can adjust." Her face lit up with pleasure. "I was hoping you'd say that. The city holds too many difficult memories for you. The lake can be your fresh start." "I'll need to give notice at my teaching job," I said, thinking through the logistics. "And figure out what to do with the house." "Sell it," she advised without hesitation. "Use the money to renovate the cabin. Make it truly yours. The school near the lake would be lucky to have you, or—" She hesitated, a gleam in her eye. "Or what?" "Or you could consider taking a more active role in the family business. We've been discussing expanding into online sales of curated antiques, possibly even a small publishing venture for books on collectibles and design. Someone with your organizational skills and eye for aesthetics would be perfect to oversee such projects." I blinked, surprised. "Me? Work for Green's Antiques?" but I don't know anything about the business." "You know more than you think," she countered. "And you can learn the rest. The important thing is that you understand our values, our commitment to quality and integrity. The technical details are teachable." The idea was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Leave teaching after more than a decade? Take on a role in a business I'd only ever observed from the periphery? But then again, hadn't the past year proven I was capable of far more than I'd believed? "I'll think about it," I promised. "But first, the move." The next few months passed in a whirlwind of activity. I gave notice at my school, put the house on the market, and worked with a contractor on updates to the cabin. A larger kitchen, expanded bedrooms for the children, a proper office space for myself. Dan was surprisingly amenable to the move, perhaps because it put physical distance between our lives while still allowing his regular visitation schedule. The house sold quickly for more than I'd expected in Cedarwood's competitive market. Between those proceeds and my new financial security, I was able to create a home at the lake that reflected who we were becoming rather than who we had been. By August, we were fully settled in the renovated cabin. Floor-to-ceiling windows now lined the lake-facing wall, flooding the expanded living area with light. The children's rooms were personalized to their tastes, nautical themes for Jack, a nature-inspired sanctuary for Sophie. My own bedroom was simple but luxurious, with a reading nook overlooking the water and the first truly comfortable mattress I'd owned in years. "It's perfect, Mom," Sophie declared as she arranged her collection of rocks and feathers on her new windowsill. "It feels like our real home now." Her words stayed with me that night as I sat alone on the dock, watching moonlight shimmer on the water. Our real home. Not the house where they'd been born, where we'd lived as a complete family, but this place we'd created after everything had fallen apart and been rebuilt. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dan and Mandy's betrayal, painful as it had been, had ultimately freed me from a marriage that had been slowly suffocating me without my awareness. Their greed had prompted Grandma Ellie's intervention, which had given me financial independence I'd never imagined possible. Their cruelty had pushed me to discover a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I heard footsteps on the dock behind me and turned to see Grandma Ellie approaching, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, settling beside me without waiting for an answer. The children are both asleep. Jack was reading, with a flashlight under his covers, but I pretended not to notice. I smiled. He's always been a night owl. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the gentle lap of water against the pilings, the distant call of an owl from the woods behind the cabin. "Are you happy, Rebecca?" she asked finally, her voice soft in the darkness. I considered the question seriously. Was I happy? Not in the uncomplicated way I'd been before discovering Dan's betrayal. But there was something deeper, more substantial growing in its place. A contentment rooted in self-knowledge, in boundaries, in choosing my own path rather than following one laid out by others' expectations. "I think I'm getting there," I answered honestly. "I'm not who I was a year ago, and I'm glad of that, even if the journey was painful." She nodded, satisfied. "Growth usually is. The most valuable lessons rarely come easily." "I've been thinking about your offer," I said, changing the subject. "About working for Green's Antiques. And I'd like to try. Part-time at first, while the kids adjust to their new school. But yes, I'm interested in the online expansion, the publishing venture. It sounds exciting." Grandma Ellie squeezed my hand, her expression pleased but not surprised, as if she'd known all along what my decision would be. "You'll be wonderful at it. You always had a good eye and excellent judgment. Now you have the confidence to match." As we sat together in the moonlight, I felt a sense of possibility expanding before me, like the lake stretching to the horizon. For so long, I'd defined myself in relation to others, Dan's wife, Jack, and Sophie's mother. Mandy's more responsible sister. Now I was beginning to see myself as a whole person, distinct and complete in my own right. The journey wasn't over, of course. There would be challenges ahead, helping the children adjust to their new school, navigating co-parenting with Dan from a distance, learning the intricacies of a business I was just beginning to understand. The relationship with my sister remained, a painful wound that might never fully heal. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was facing the future with anticipation rather than dread. The path forward was mine to choose, no longer determined by others' choices or betrayals. "It's getting chilly," Grandma Ellie observed, pulling her shawl tighter. "We should head inside." I stood and offered her my hand, which she accepted with a smile. As we walked back toward the cabin, warm light spilling from its windows onto the grass, I felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who had seen my worth when I couldn't see it myself, who had fought for justice when I was too wounded to fight, who had given me not just material security but the far more valuable gift of believing in my strength. "Thank you," I said simply as we reached the porch, "for everything." She patted my cheek affectionately. "You did the hard part yourself, dear. I just provided a little leverage." That night, I slept deeply and dreamlessly, lulled by the gentle sounds of the lake and the knowledge that we were exactly where we needed to be. The transition into fall brought new routines and challenges. Jack and Sophie started at their new school, smaller than their previous one, with a focus on outdoor education that suited them perfectly. Jack joined the science club and made friends with a group of boys who shared his interest in fishing and building things. Sophie flourished in the art program, her natural talent nurtured by a teacher who recognized her potential. I began working part-time for Green's Antiques, 3 days a week at the main office in town, learning the business from the ground up despite my nominal position as a board member and shareholder. Uncle Peter proved to be a patient mentor, explaining the intricacies of provenance and valuation, introducing me to key vendors and clients, teaching me to spot the difference between genuine antiques and clever reproductions. The online expansion project became my primary focus, creating a digital catalog of select pieces, developing a website that captured the elegance and history of the family business, establishing protocols for shipping valuable items safely across the country and beyond. It was challenging, absorbing work that engaged parts of my mind that teaching had never touched. Grandma Ellie was right. I did have an eye for it. My background in education made me adept at explaining the significance and stories behind particular pieces, adding depth that customers appreciated. My organizational skills transferred seamlessly to inventory management and project coordination. By Thanksgiving, the online store was flourishing, generating significant new revenue for the business. Dan continued his visitation schedule, though the dynamics had shifted with our move to the lake. Now he would spend 1 full weekend a month at a small hotel near our cabin, taking the children for outdoor activities during the day and returning them at night. Our exchanges remained civil but distant, focused entirely on the children's needs and schedules. Mandy I hadn't seen or spoken to since our confrontation at Grandma Ellie's house. Through family gossip, I learned that she and Dan had abandoned their plans to purchase lakefront property, instead buying a downtown loft closer to his office. She had received a promotion at her marketing firm and was traveling frequently for work. They seemed to be moving forward with their lives as I was with mine. Until one crisp October afternoon, when the past crashed unexpectedly back into my present. I was working from home that day, finalizing the holiday catalog for Green's Antiques while the children were at school. The cabin was peaceful, leaves in brilliant autumn colors drifting past the windows as I typed at my desk. The sound of tires on gravel alerted me to a visitor, unexpected, as we rarely had drop-ins at our remote location. Through the window, I saw a familiar red convertible parking beside my SUV. Mandy. My heart rate instantly accelerated, fight-or-flight instincts kicking in after months of carefully maintained distance. What was she doing here? How had she even found the place? I briefly considered not answering the door, but curiosity overcame caution. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the entrance and pulled it open just as she raised her hand to knock. "Becca," she said, sounding slightly breathless. "I hope it's okay that I came by. Uncle Peter gave me the address." She looked different. Somehow, her hair shorter, her usually immaculate makeup minimal, her expensive clothes replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. There was a vulnerability in her expression I'd rarely seen. "What do you want, Mandy?" I asked, not inviting her in. She hugged herself against the autumn chill. "To talk. Just talk. Please?" Against my better judgment, I stepped aside to let her enter. She walked into the main room, her eyes widening as she took in the renovations, the expanded space, the wall of windows overlooking the lake, the tasteful furnishings that blended rustic charm with modern comfort. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "You've done something special here." "Thank you," I replied stiffly. "Would you like coffee? I was just about to make some." She nodded, following me to the kitchen area at the far end of the great room. I busied myself with the coffee maker, grateful for the mundane task to occupy my hands while my mind raced with questions. "How are Jack and Sophie?" she asked, perching on a stool at the kitchen island. "They're doing well. They like their new school. Sophie's really into painting now, and Jack joined a robotics club." I kept my answers brief, unwilling to share too much of my children's lives with someone who had chosen to exit them so completely. She nodded, a flash of regret crossing her face. "I've missed them." "You made that choice," I reminded her, my voice sharper than intended. "I know." She accepted the coffee mug I handed her, wrapping her hands around it as if seeking warmth. "I've made a lot of choices I regret lately." I leaned against the counter, maintaining distance between us. "Why are you here, Mandy? What do you want?" She took a deep breath, staring into her coffee. "Dan and I broke up." The words hung in the air between us. I should have felt something. Satisfaction, vindication, perhaps even a petty sort of pleasure. Instead, I felt oddly hollow. "I'm sorry," I said finally, and meant it. Not because I wished they had stayed together, but because I knew the pain of a relationship's end, regardless of the circumstances. "No, you're not," she countered with a small, sad smile. "And you shouldn't be. But I thought you should know." "Why?" She shrugged, a gesture that reminded me suddenly of the little girl she'd once been, trying to explain why she'd taken my favorite doll without asking. "Because it matters. Because after everything that happened, everything we did, to you, it seems important that you know it didn't work out, that it wasn't worth it." I processed this, uncertain how to respond. "When did this happen?" "About a month ago. He's moving to Chicago for a new job. A fresh start, he says." There was bitterness in her tone that suggested the decision hadn't been mutual. "And you? What will you do?" "Keep working. Keep trying to fix the mess I've made of my life." She looked up at me directly for the first time since entering the cabin. "Starting with this conversation." I waited, sensing there was more. "I owe you an apology, Becca. Not just for Dan, though obviously for that too, but for everything. For the way I've competed with you our whole lives, for never being the sister you deserved." Her voice wavered slightly. "I've been doing a lot of therapy since the breakup, trying to understand why I make the choices I do, why I always want what other people have instead of appreciating what's mine." It was such an unexpected turn in the conversation that I found myself momentarily speechless. In all our years of sisterhood, through countless conflicts and reconciliations, Mandy had never acknowledged her pattern of competition and envy so directly. "That must be difficult work," I said finally, unsure what else to offer. She nodded, blinking rapidly against tears. It is, but necessary. I realized I've spent my whole life believing I was entitled to whatever I wanted, regardless of who it hurt. That's not who I want to be anymore. I felt my defenses softening despite my determination to remain guarded. This was the sister I remembered from childhood, the one who could be vulnerable and genuine when she wasn't performing for an audience. What do you want from me, Mandy? Forgiveness? Because I'm not sure I'm there yet. No, she said quickly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I haven't earned that. I wanted you to know that I understand what I did now. The real harm, not just the surface stuff. And I'm sorry. Truly sorry. She stood abruptly, as if staying longer might break her composure completely. I should go. The kids will be home from school soon, right? I don't want to complicate things. I glanced at the clock. She was right. The school bus would arrive in less than an hour. Yes, they will. They look happy in the photos, Uncle. Peter shows me, she said, moving toward the door. You've done a good job with them, Becca. You always were the strong one. As she reached for the doorknob, a question suddenly pressed itself from my mind to my lips. Does Grandma Ellie know you're here? Mandy turned, a flicker of her old mischievous smile appearing briefly. No, this was my idea. Though I think she'd approve of me taking accountability for once in my life. And then she was gone, the red convertible disappearing down the gravel drive, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a half-empty coffee mug and a tangle of emotions I couldn't immediately sort through. I called Grandma Ellie that evening after the children were in bed, needing her perspective on Mandy's unexpected visit. She came to apologize, I explained, still processing the encounter. She seemed different, genuine. Interesting, Grandma murmured. I wondered if the breakup might prompt some soul-searching. You knew about that? About Dan and Mandy splitting up? Of course, she confirmed. Peter keeps tabs on these things. Apparently, Daniel received a rather significant job offer in Chicago, too good to pass up, but also coincidentally requiring immediate relocation. I caught her implication immediately. You arranged it, the job offer. I may have mentioned his qualifications to an old friend who sits on their board, she admitted, not sounding remotely apologetic. The opportunity was genuine. Whether it was extended with unusual haste and exceptional terms is perhaps a matter of interpretation. I couldn't help but laugh at her audacity. You engineered their breakup. I merely created circumstances that would test their commitment, she corrected primly. If their relationship had been built on something solid, distance wouldn't have ended it. The fact that he jumped at the chance to leave suggests it was already failing. She wasn't wrong. If Dan had truly loved Mandy, truly believed their relationship was worth the destruction it had caused, a job in Chicago wouldn't have been enough to separate them. So what happens now? I asked. With Mandy, I mean. That's up to you, dear. She's made the first move toward reconciliation, but you're under no obligation to reciprocate if you're not ready. Some wounds take longer to heal than others. I thought about it, about the sister who had once been my closest confidant before years of subtle competition had eroded our bond, even before Dan entered the picture. About the children who occasionally still asked about their aunt, despite her absence from their lives. I don't know if I can trust her again, I admitted. But I think maybe, eventually, we could try to rebuild something. Not what we had before, but something new, something healthier. Time will tell, Grandma Ellie said wisely. For now, focus on the life you're creating. The rest will sort itself out. She was right, as she so often was. The life we were. Building at the lake was filling me with a sense of purpose and peace I'd never quite achieved in my marriage. The children were thriving. I was finding fulfillment in my work with the family business. And for the first time in years, I was making Choices based on what I wanted rather than what was expected of me. Winter descended on the lake with a quiet beauty that took my breath away. The water froze in crystalline patterns near the shore. Snow blanketed the surrounding woods, and on clear nights, stars scattered across the sky in numbers I'd never seen in the city. We embraced the season fully, ice skating on the lake, building snow forts, drinking hot chocolate by the fire as wind howled outside our snug cabin. Christmas approached, the first in our new home, and with it came decisions about traditions. Would we attend the family gathering at the lake house again? The thought of facing Dan, even if Mandy wouldn't be there, filled me with anxiety. But isolating ourselves didn't feel right either. We should host Christmas Eve here, Uncle Peter suggested during one of our weekly business meetings. Something small, just you and the kids, me, Eleanor, a new tradition for a new chapter. The idea immediately felt right. Our cabin had ample space, and the children were eager to show off their home to family members who hadn't yet visited. We could create our own celebration, honoring old traditions while establishing new ones that reflected who we were becoming. The holiday preparation became a family project. Jack and Sophie helped me select a perfect tree from a nearby farm, which we decorated with a mix of heirloom ornaments from Grandma Ellie and handmade creations the children crafted at school. We baked cookies using my grandmother's recipes, sent handwritten cards to friends and relatives, and filled the house with greenery gathered from our property. On Christmas Eve morning, as I was preparing for our guests' arrival, my phone rang with an unfamiliar Chicago number. Curious, I answered. "Rebecca?" Dan's voice slightly distorted by distance. "Sorry to call out of the blue. I wanted to wish the kids a Merry Christmas." "They're out with Uncle Peter getting last-minute supplies," I explained, surprised by his call. "I can have them phone you when they return." "That would be great, thanks." There was an awkward pause. "How are they doing? Peter sends me photos sometimes, but it's not the same." "They're doing really well," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Adjusting to the new school, making friends. Jack's science project won first place in his grade, and Sophie's art teacher wants to enter her painting in a regional competition." "That's fantastic," he said, genuine warmth in his voice. "And you? How are you doing with everything?" The question caught me off guard. Dan and I had carefully avoided any personal inquiries during our exchanges about the children, maintaining a strictly functional co-parenting relationship. "I'm good," I answered honestly. "The work with Green's Antiques is challenging, but rewarding. The move to the lake was the right decision for all of us." "I'm glad," he said softly. "You deserve good things, Becca." The sincerity in his voice triggered a complex wave of emotions, not longing or regret, but a bittersweet acknowledgement of all we had once been to each other, all we had lost, all we had both gained and suffered in the aftermath. "Thank you," I managed. "How's Chicago treating you?" "Cold," he chuckled. "But good. New job, new apartment, new life." He hesitated. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about the past year, about the choices I made, the people I hurt. I owe you an apology, Rebecca. A real one, not the half-hearted justifications I've offered before. Like sister, like brother-in-law, apparently." "Dan, no, please, let me say this," he interrupted gently. "What I did, the affair with Mandy, the financial deception, all of it, was inexcusable. I could offer explanations about feeling trapped or unappreciated, but the truth is simpler and uglier. I was selfish. I put my wants above my responsibilities, to you and the children, and I'm deeply, genuinely sorry." I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, snow falling gently outside the windows, absorbing the apology I'd never expected to receive. What did one say to such a thing? "Thank you? I forgive you? It's water under the bridge?" "I appreciate your saying that," I said finally. "It means something to hear it." "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued. "But I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, a better father, a better person. Chicago is partly about that. A fresh start, a chance to figure out who I want to be going forward. That sounds positive, I offered, unsure how else to respond to this new, reflective version of my ex-husband. It is. Another pause. Listen, I was thinking. If it's okay with you, I'd like to have the kids visit during their spring break. I could show them the city, take them to the museums and the aquarium. My apartment has a spare room they could share. It was the first time he'd suggested anything beyond his regular visitation schedule, the first indication he wanted to be more actively involved in their lives despite the distance. I'll need to think about it, I said carefully. And talk to Jack and Sophie about how they feel. But if they're comfortable with the idea, then yes, I think that could work. Thank you, he said, relief evident in his voice. That's more than fair. Just let me know. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen window, watching Snow Blanket, the lake in pristine white. So much had changed in a year. My marriage ended, my relationship with my sister fractured and potentially beginning to heal, my career transformed, our home relocated. Yet despite all the upheaval, I felt more centered, more authentically myself than I had in years. The sound of tires on the driveway announced Uncle Peter's return with the children. They burst through the door in a flurry of excitement and, cold air, cheeks flushed, arms laden with last-minute decorations and treats. "Mom, we found the perfect pine cones for the mantel," Sophie exclaimed, dumping her treasures on the kitchen table. "And Uncle Peter let us pick out the Christmas crackers," Jack added, holding up a festive box. "The fancy British kind with actual good stuff inside, not just paper hats." Uncle Peter followed them in, carrying grocery bags and stamping snow from his boots. "The enthusiasm of youth," he commented with a smile. "They've been this excited since we left the house." "Dad called," I told the children as they shed their coats and gloves. "He wants to wish you a Merry Christmas. You can call him back after you warm up." They nodded, unsurprised by the contact from their father, who had maintained regular phone calls despite the physical distance. Another change from the immediate aftermath of the divorce. Dan was making a consistent effort to be present in their lives, even if from afar. The rest of the day unfolded in a pleasant blur of preparation. We finished decorating, prepared food for dinner, wrapped last-minute gifts. Grandma Ellie arrived in the late afternoon, bringing additional desserts, and her traditional Christmas punch. The cabin filled with delicious smells, music, and laughter. As we gathered around the table for Christmas Eve dinner, candles glowing in the early darkness, I looked at the faces of those I loved most in the world. My children, excited and happy in our new home. My grandmother, proud and elegant even in her casual holiday attire. My uncle, who had become not just a mentor, but a true friend through the past difficult year. "Before we eat," Grandma Ellie said, raising her glass, "I'd like to propose a toast. To new beginnings, to hard-won wisdom, and to the family we choose to build around us, not just the one we're born into." "To family," we echoed, glasses clinking in the warm light. Later, after the children had opened their Christmas Eve gifts, new pajamas, as tradition dictated, and gone to bed vibrating with anticipation for morning, I sat by the fire with Grandma, Ellie sipping mulled wine and enjoying the peaceful moment. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I changed my will last Christmas, I thought I was just protecting you and the children from Daniel and Amanda's schemes. I never anticipated it would set in motion such a complete transformation." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Sometimes the hardest moments lead us exactly where we need to be. "Indeed," she agreed, patting my hand affectionately. "And where you are, my dear, is exactly where you belong." As the fire crackled and snow continued to fall outside our windows, I felt a profound sense of contentment. The path forward wasn't perfect or without challenges, but it was mine, chosen with intention, built with courage, sustained by the love of those who truly had my best interests at heart. In losing what I thought I couldn't live without, I had found something far more valuable: myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.